Okay, today we're going to be going over lesson 7, and last time we finished the baby slide deck. So we're not using any of this anymore. This is all done. So lesson 7 is about present and future. There's present 1 and future 1 is what we're covering. Uh, Maybe I'll go over what the ones mean later, but the rest of the curriculum doesn't go over what 2 or 3 are. So don't worry about it too much. So tenses is a term we use to usually describe the time in which a verb takes place. And then there's another term called aspect, which is giving you a context for the action or how the action exists over time. So tense would be present, past, future. The aspect would be, here are some examples, perfect. This is using the other meaning of perfect, not like amazing, but being complete. So the present perfect means the action is completed by now. The past perfect is the action is completed in the past. Future perfect would be by the time we get to the future, the action would have been completed. Progressive is still occurring, so again, that could be past, present, or future progressive. And then habitual is something that's a repetitive or a routine action. When you combine tense with aspect, Coptic has, depending how you count, 31 to 45 tenses or aspects, or tense aspects is what I call it. Because, like I said, there's present 1, and there's future 1, but there's also present 2, present 3, future 2, future 3, and then there's past 1, past 2, probably past 3, right? And then not just those, there's also a specific tense for to say before something, or is it before? Yeah, I think before something. And then there's another tense for may, right? So when I say tense in Coptic, it's more of a loose term. It's not the same way in English where tense just means present, future, past, etc. It's more the whole tense slash aspect. That's why I call it a tense aspect. This lesson, we're going to look at what is called the simple present and the simple future, or present 1 and future 1. So in English, if you want to conjugate a verb, it's very simple. If you guys have taken any other foreign language, especially Spanish, you'll learn conjugating. There'll be a whole chart, and you have to change it, the form of every single thing for every tense, for every person, for every number. In English, it's very easy. You just put the subject behind it, and then you throw an S if you need to. Um, but Coptic is somewhere in the middle. And thankfully, we learned half of what you need to know how to do the Coptic. Unfortunately, this thing is blocking half the words, but hopefully we can figure out what it means. In Coptic, to conjugate, we add a dependent pronoun plus or minus other tense-specific particles. Luckily, the two tenses we're talking about today is very simple. They don't have, well, they do. One of them doesn't have any tense-specific particle. The other one does. So we're going to see what I mean when I say those words. The dependent pronoun is from one of the earlier lessons on pronouns, I believe lesson 4, but don't quote me on that if I'm wrong. You could look through the playlist or the previous videos and you'll see the one that's titled pronouns. It'll be very clear. Both of these make use of prefix pronouns. So, yeah, it says right there, lesson 4. So if you go back to lesson 4, you'll notice there's two charts for pronouns. There's the prefix pronoun, and then there's the suffix, or I forgot what other term I use, maybe affix pronoun. So the prefix means it's at the very, very, very beginning. There's nothing before it. So when you use these two tenses, present 1 and future 1, it uses those pronouns. This is a little system I made to try to make sense of how Coptic conjugation works in like a Western mindset, even though I'm like pretty sure this might not be how they saw it, especially because Coptic didn't have spaces, so trying to figure out what they saw as little word parts could be slightly tricky. Before I move on, another funny thing about the Coptic tenses, this 31 to 45 is counting from a specific website that happens to have Coptic verb charts. But I realized recently it's actually missing some because you could mix and match these different tense aspects together. So this might sound counterintuitive, but for example, we're going to be learning today future one. You could mix the future one with the past one. And you might say, how do you have past and future? The best way you could translate it is instead of saying will, you say would. So if you want to say would in Coptic, you'd make it both past and you'd make it future. Which is it's funny to me, but that's an aside. So there are actually more tenses than what I wrote. Anyway, so I'm going to try to use this color coding system. And these are the abbreviations I'm going to use. So there's A, and then P, B, and then V. P obviously is pronoun. V is obviously verb. A and B, I hope it's obvious. I use A and B because those are the first two letters in the alphabet. So A would be if the tense itself has a particle before the pronoun. B would be if the tense itself has a particle either after the pronoun or before the verb. Technically both are true, but it depends on what perspective you're looking. And P here is specifically the dependent pronoun. If you guys remember what that means, dependent means it's not its own word, right? So the difference between enthok, which means you, or just k, just the letter K. So here I'm talking about if the letter K is being used, for example. So this is the general thing. Not all four are always used. So we're going to see today one of these tenses uses just P and V, and the other one of these tenses just uses P, B, and V. But there are other tenses that just use APV, like B isn't there, right? So depending on the tense, it'll use different things. This is just a general structure. So when I go into future tenses later, and I don't mean future like future, but I mean, anyway, this is the color coding I'm going to try to use, and this is the general structure I'm going to use. So I'm going to refer back to this. Okay, I said that already. All right. So another confusing thing, and I didn't write the. I wrote this before I figured this out. When I wrote this, I realized almost every tense has two ways of writing it, and I found out recently there's actually a third way of writing it. But I think for you guys, just knowing two of them is more than enough for now, especially because I'm still trying to figure out how and when to use the third one. So the first one, the main one I'm talking about, the APBV, we could think of that as the pronoun way or the pronominal quote unquote conjugation. That's what that one is. If you guys remember from last lesson, nominal is another way of saying using a noun. So there's another way of conjugating these verbs if you're using a noun. So that's called the nominal conjugation system. So there's the pronominal conjugation system and there's the nominal conjugation system. Hopefully none of you are colorblind, but I have A as yellow, P as red, B as green, V as blue, and then I have nominal as teal. Why does that matter? Usually, I think always, but usually, if there is an A in the conjugation system, the nominal form will have a modified or even the same thing to be put before the subject, right? So instead of APBV, it'll be like A, noun, and then V. So if that one, I'm going to call AN. Unfortunately, I'm going over like shorthands and it doesn't make sense until we actually see examples, but I want to get this out of the way first. And I mentioned here practice problems earlier, so I might as well pull that up so you know what I mean. So in this example, I mentioned if you put a before a verb or before a subject at the start of a clause, before the subject, it will make the sentence past tense. So this a is actually both a and an. In the case that we had before, it's an. All right, now we're going to talk about two actual tenses, and hopefully the notation will make sense. Present one is the simplest tense in Coptic. It expresses either the simple present or the present progressive. What does that mean? If I say I talk, it could mean either I talk or I am talking. Both of those, they use the same form in Coptic. A lot of languages actually do that. In English is one of the only ones that definitely uses a different form to express both things. Then the pronominal conjugation structure is you just put the pronoun with the verb. Nothing special. In this case, this is the first thing. So you're going to have to use the pronoun, the prefix form of the pronoun. And if I don't write it again, I'm going to go back to the pronoun table. If it's nominal, right? So we're not using the pronoun. If it's nominal, if it's just the noun, you just put the verb after the subject. You don't have to put anything. There's no an here, right? Because there's no a. Since there's no a, there won't be an an. I lied with this lastly thing, unless I mention it later. Okay, I do. So that will be quote unquote lastly. If you want to negate the sentence, if you want to make it not, I am not talking. I do not talk. You put on at the end of the sentence, of the clause. The clause, if you remember, is the part of the sentence that has like a full idea almost. You put on at the end, and then if you want, you don't have to, you put n with a jinkum on it before the pronoun. So let me jump ahead just so you can see what I'm talking about. So if you want to say I do not hear, you say tisotem on or en tisotem on. Both are fine. Both are understandable. So this table should look very familiar. This is pretty much copy pasted from the pronoun section. Because, like I just said, the present one is just the pronoun. So you put T and then the verb. Ka, then the verb. Or this ka also. If you guys remember the difference between these two, is this one used to be the K in skip. Well, let me pick a different word. Scat. And then this is the K in cat. So this one is more emphatic. There's an extra puff of air. If you put like a piece of paper in front of your mouth, then when you say scat, the paper won't fly. But when you say cat, the paper will fly. So you use this one when it's before these sounds. Either vita, alola, mi, ni, ro, or when yota is used as a y, or when this combination is used as a w. Te if you're talking to a girl. F is he, se is she, but both of them could be used for it because of the two gender system. Ten for we, te ten for you all, well, you, and then se for they. And an example is with sotem. Sotem means here. So ti sotem is I here. Xotem or ex sotem is you here if you're talking to a guy. Te sotem is you here if you're talking to a girl. Sotem or F sotem is he hears. Sisotem is she hears. Ten sotem is we hear. Ten sotem is you hear if you're talking to multiple people. And se sotem is they hear. And then, like I said, to negate, you just put an n at the beginning. Optional, but you have to put on at the end. That's for this tense. Other tenses might have different negating systems. And I'll be honest, that range is actually due to the negating system. So if you just do the difference here, you see 14. So there are 14 quote-unquote tenses that negate differently than just adding on at the end. But we're not gonna, at least the curriculum I have here is not gonna go into all those tenses. So I guess don't worry. Anyway, So the nominal, remember, means you use the noun as a subject as opposed to a pronoun. This can only be done if the pronoun is before the verb, right? Sorry, if the noun is written before the verb. Sorry, if the noun is written before the verb, you do it this way. What do I mean? So if I want to say Peter hears, right? Petros sotem. Peter hears. But remember, we learned before, I could put Peter at the end of the sentence, right? So if I put sotem, and we learned if I want to put the subject later, I have to write NJ. Petros. Now this is actually wrong. Why is it wrong? When you have NJ, you still need to put the pronoun. So Petros is third person masculine singular, so it'll be F sotem, NJ Petros. So the NJ is telling you this F is Petros. This is a redundancy used in Coptic to make sure whatever's being said is very clear, especially due to the word order being willy-nilly. You have to be as clear as possible in Coptic, so they be very redundant. So if you have the noun, the nominal, the noun in the sentence, but it's not before the verb, you have to use the system we just talked about before with the pronoun. If it's before the verb, you could use the nominal system. The funny thing is, I think I wrote it here. Yeah. So here's the one I said, the nominal system. The funny thing is, you could write the subject and then still conjugate it and it's still understood. So I said Petros sotem, right? But I could also say Petros sotem. And that means the exact same thing. You wouldn't translate it as Peter he hears. Peter is the he. Unless the context of the sentence is you're talking to Peter. That's different, right? So if you're saying Petros, he, some other person hears, unfortunately, it'll be written the same way, but context will give you what's happening. So here are some examples, and luckily, these examples, what's the word I'm looking for? Use both things I just mentioned. So John 3:35, it says the Father loves the Son. Fiot me emepshiri. Notice, fiot, subject, me is the word for love. There's no pronoun anywhere. Emepshiri. There's no pronoun anywhere. There's no A anywhere. There's no B anywhere. Because the present one is very simple. Remember, here's the color coding. The subject, I will make it in teal. A will be yellow, P will be red, B will be green, V will be blue. But a very similar sentence, John 5:20, for the Father loves the Son. Fiot rar, F me, emepshiri. So the F here means he, but the he here is referring to the Father. So it's just like in Spanish. I don't know enough Spanish. It's just like in Spanish if you have the subject, and then you need to make the verb match the subject, right? So it's the same thing here. This is making the verb match the subject, even though it's optional in this specific tense. In other tenses, it's not optional. All right, future one. It's very simple. It's pretty much the same thing, except you add one thing, which is why I put it in the same lesson and I didn't make it a separate lesson. The funny thing is, most scholars, they try to put the future one as a present tense. And the reason for that is, just like in English when we say something will, blah, 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 the Coptic form that we put instead of will, it literally means going. Like it comes from the word that means to go. So it literally means going. So it's like when you're telling someone, I'm going to blah, blah, blah. I'm going to talk. So in English, when you say I'm going to talk, There is an aspect of it going to be in the future, but it's not future. So sometimes a present verb that in our brain would be present would be written in the future. Future one, this one specifically. There are other future tenses that are not as um, ambiguous. But anyway, so this one we add be. If you remember, be is there's a particle before the verb. If it's nominal, so not pronoun, the be sticks with the v. Okay, so you need to have be with v. And we're going to have an example, don't worry. You negate it the same way as present one, and this is what be is. Be in this case is na. Right here, na. So this is what the pronominal would look like. Tina, kna. Now realize, because the n is always after it, the kappa can't be kappa anymore. It's always ki. Kna. Tera. Now this is a funny exception, irregularity. The ni here becomes a ro. Tenna is also acceptable, but it's not common. So even in our hymns, where like for Kiak, when we say you will bear a son, we say or you will conceive, we say terra voki. We don't say tenna voki. Terra voki. Fna for masculine, sna, sorry, for he, sna for she will, tenna for we will, tetenna for you will, plural, senna for they will. Here's an example with the word go. Tina go, kna go, tera go, fna go, sna go, tenna go, tetenna go, senna go. I should have said Joe, but it's okay. Only in the church we pronounce that letter as G. A lot of people, a lot of scholars say it's something like Ja or something similar, and always there's no exception, which it makes sense when you look at other things, but it's okay. That's not what this talks about. Negation is the same thing. Put on at the end. You can put an N before it. Let's hope I put an example. I didn't, because why would I? Alright. Passive voice. This is something I mentioned a couple times already. One time I mentioned in passing, another time it was actually in the slide. Passive means the subject receives the action. Coptic doesn't have its own passive conjugation. And I put in parentheses, although some verbs are intrinsically passive. What do I mean? There are verbs, for example, to become red. That's probably not true. Become black, I don't think exists, or become white exists. So to become white is a verb, but that already has a passive aspect to it, if that makes sense. Because the subject is what's becoming white. Probably a bad example. There are better examples. So, if it's a verb that does not have that intrinsically passive thing, we do it in a funny way. This is what we do. We use the third person plural pronoun as a subject, but with the prefix. Like we wouldn't write enthou. We're not going to write the actual full pronoun. We're going to use the prefix, and this goes for any tense. So whatever tense you want to do, you could use third person plural. You use they as the subject, and then the receiver you write like normal, like a direct object. This they is what some grammarians would call an impersonal subject. That means there's a subject there, but it's not actually a thing. So an example we have in English is when we say it's raining. What's it? There is no it. We're putting it there so the phrase quote unquote makes sense in English grammar, because you can't just say rains. That doesn't make sense. So you say it's raining. So in Coptic, we use they, but there is no they. It's like an abstract they. So if you're saying they call me something, they call me Peter. That's another way of saying I am called Peter. The annoying thing is their equivalence. Sometimes it does mean they, sometimes it doesn't mean they. So you need the context. So here, semuti eroi, here would mean either they call me or I am called, depending on context. And that's why in the Sunday Theotekeia, when we have semuti ero, it's usually, and it should be translated as you are called, even though literally it's they call you. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing.